Hi guys, welcome to Bible Breakdown. We're doing Acts chapter 23. All right, y'all. We have been dragging this book. I don't know what it is about Acts. I've tried to read it before and I've had the same issue where I just stop. I don't know, but we're going to finish this book this week. I was supposed to finish this in the first week of January and we are about to end March. So yeah, that's unacceptable. But again, as I always say, thank you guys so much for your patience. I really appreciate it. And I don't want Bible Breakdown to be something that isn't genuine and authentic just because I'm trying to meet a quota. So yeah, I've been taking my time lately, but I feel like I am ready to just be more consistent like I used to be. So with that being said, let's get into the summary, and then after that we will get into the breakdown. If you need a refresher, because it's been like 2 weeks since the last time I filmed, please watch the last video so you can catch up and be refreshed. So just to touch base quickly, the last thing that we mentioned was that they found out that Paul is actually a Roman citizen. So now this is the next day, and for the summary I wrote, Paul speaks before the Sanhedrins and priests, stating how he's living his life before God in good conscience. This causes him to get hit in the mouth, which led to Paul informing them the judgment of the Lord will fall upon them, and question why this judgment is being placed over him. The people around Paul wondered why he spoke to such a high priest this way, and Paul admitted to not being aware of his status. It became known to Paul the room was split between Sadducees and Pharisees. Paul explained he was a Pharisee himself, and the reason for judgment is due to the hope of the resurrection of the dead. This made a discussion begin between all, leading to division. Sadducees believed against the resurrection, angels, or spirit, but the Pharisees thought otherwise. This discussion started to intensify, causing the commander to order the troops to take Paul away before he gets torn apart. The next night, the Lord met Paul, stating for him to have courage and expressing the necessity for Paul to testify in Rome. The next morning, 40-plus Jews vowed to not eat or drink until the execution of Paul is completed. They expressed this choice to the chief priests and elders. They made a plan to set Paul up and execute him themselves. Paul's nephew heard this information and went to deliver it to Paul. When finding this out, Paul requested the troops bring his nephew to the commander to further report this information. They fulfilled his request, and the nephew was able to speak with the commander privately. He told the commander the plan of the Jews, which the commander ensured to the nephew not to expose. He's been informed on this information. There was word from the commander to prepare troops for the night and make sure to safely transport Paul to the governor named Felix. The commander wrote him a letter updating him on the situation that's unfolding. They fulfilled the mission, which led the governor to allow a hearing to be had once Paul's accusers arrived. Until then, Paul was kept safe in Herod's palace. So now for the breakdown, the start of this chapter is the same as the last chapter's last title, if that makes sense. But that was Paul before the Sanhedrin. For the next few chapters, I feel like I'm going to be mentioning themes rather than breaking down every little part of the chapter. I feel like that just makes it better to understand. So with that being said, the theme that I came up for this chapter was the Lord's preservation will overcome any weapons formed against you. For verses 1 to 11, I wrote the key points to focus on before proceeding is 1. Paul gets slapped in the mouth for being offensive towards the rulers, but takes back his smart remark after finding out the position that these people were in. 2, Paul starts an argument between the Sanhedrins, which is the committee, because they're split between Sadducees and Pharisees. And the argument is based off of the truth behind the resurrection. And note that the Pharisees are claiming that Paul is not wrong. And after all this happens, Paul is now removed and visited by the Lord, and this is confirmation that the Lord has plans over Paul's life to preserve him throughout this chaos. So going back to the theme, the weapon formed against him is the people slapping him, and I feel like the argument that's happening over what Paul is going through. So the slap in the mouth is referenced in verse 1 to 3, and then him starting that argument is in verses 6 to 9. But then in verse 11 it says, the following night the Lord stood by him and said, have courage, for you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so it is necessary for you to testify in Rome. This is foreshadowing something that will happen in the next few chapters. The next section is titled, The Plot Against Paul. For verses 12 to 22, I wrote, "The people going against Paul put a curse over themselves if they don't kill him. Rather than this being a secret, Paul and the commander is informed by Paul's nephew, which had Paul transferred safely and protected by 470 men." I think that speaks for itself, like the protection of God, because the fact that Paul's nephew was around those people that were talking about killing Paul in that moment, and then was able to go to Paul, and then Paul was able to request to go to the commander, and now the commander's on his side. Like, it's just like, it blows my mind. So in response to this, Paul has 470 men to protect him. And that point also leads to the next section, which is titled "To Caesarea by Night." So I'll just mix those two together. So from verses 12 to 35, for verses 23 to 35, I wrote that it shows further the lengths of protection from God. So 1, it talks about traveling in the night. 2, it talks about the letter being delivered. And 3, the governor agrees to the request. Going back to the 470 men, in verse 23 it says, "Get 200 soldiers ready and 70 cavalry and 200 spearmen to go to Caesarea at 9 tonight." So protection number 1 and 2 is getting those men and also leaving at nighttime, because the people that are trying to attack Paul is most likely sleeping. 2, the commander wrote a letter that is verses 26 to 30, and that just explains the situation going on. And then verses 33 and continuing is when the governor receives the letter. And then verse 35, he says, "I will give you a hearing whenever your accusers also get here." He ordered that he be kept under guard in Herod's palace. So tying this back to the theme, like I was saying, the Lord's preservation will overcome any weapons formed against you. I feel like this applies to all of our lives, because not to the extreme of Paul, but I feel like we've been in situations where nothing but God got us through. Reading that chapter just fascinates me, how Paul is untouched and the promise of God is being fulfilled. But that is all I have for you guys, and I will see you in the next video. I love y'all. God loves y'all more. Have a great night.